In her final episode on the independent assessment process, Kathleen joins us now. With me now is Kathleen Martens. Thanks for joining us, Kathleen.
Happy to be here.
How did you first hear about the issues going on with the IAP?
Well, we received a tip, which a lot of reporters know is 50-50. You never know how it's going to go. But this tipster was very well informed, had documents, had names, had deep knowledge of the issue, and could arrange for us to speak to people who were affected. And as we looked into the tipster's information, we found out that it was solid, and it was leading us, we didn't know how long and how deep the story would go, but we knew we had a live one, so to speak. And we remain grateful to that tipster.
Okay. And so what was the outcome for survivors like Annie Plume and Doris Bird?
Well, really only appearing on APTN Investigates to tell their stories, which is not, in many people's eyes, much of a reward, but it wasn't easy for them. They were some of the first survivors of residential schools, so they had it very tough. So for them to tell their stories on television showed how serious of an issue it was. Annie died not long after the issue became public, and Doris, there was no compensation. It certainly caused a stir nationally and in the news. Other media started picking up the stories once we were reporting them, but there was no justice for them in the sense of the word. There no extra compensation. It brought attention to what had happened. And later on, Annie's son, Tyrone, joined with Doris and others to file a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit against one of the lawyers involved, David Blott. But at that time, Blott had closed his offices and had retired as a lawyer. And so he had allegedly no funds to pay this class action. And so it just kind of petered out. And so there was nothing other than their legacy of telling their stories, which I believe is still important, that's part of what happened to residential schools in Canada, residential school survivors in Canada, who were finally going to get compensation. Some were then exploited by lawyers.
And can you talk about what some of the issues were with the IAP hearings and what's been learned since your stories aired?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for those who don't know, IAP stands for Independent Assessment Process, and it was this mandatory hearing for survivors who were alleging very serious issues of physical and sexual abuse. And it was almost like a mini trial. They had to testify, they had to be in a room with Canada's lawyers and an IAP adjudicator, and then there may have been some other lawyers there. They couldn't testify in their own language. They were rarely allowed a support person. It was deemed, it was scary for them. It was anxiety-inducing for many, and yet others said they found it kind of cathartic to be able to tell their whole story of what happened to them and have people actually listen. So, there was one part of it that was valuable, but otherwise they were much maligned, these hearings. And then you would get points assessed for your answers, and then that would help determine how much compensation you would receive. So it was kind of cold, if you will. It wasn't trauma-informed. The resulting stories we did on these hearings led to subsequent class actions for day school survivors, 60 Scoop survivors, boarding school survivors. There have a number of class actions since then that have made a point of saying we learned from the IAP hearings that were required of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and there won't be any IAP. So now usually you fill out a form that's online, or you write out your story by hand, and you don't have to sit in a room with strangers who are lawyers assessing you. Some wish they could do that, but generally they were considered a negative experience.
That makes sense, and you know, that's a pretty huge catalyst of events that has happened since your stories have aired. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about some of the big milestones in your career. You've worked for APTN Investigates for 7 years.
Yeah, it's a fantastic show. You know, it was an incredible opportunity. I remain grateful that I worked for the show and had the opportunity to dig into these complex stories. That's not a luxury I have now in daily news, where you've got to get the story out the same day. So to have that kind of time, the ability to travel all over the country to remote communities to the far north, it was just an incredible opportunity I just couldn't have imagined. And when you see the photos of Tyrone and Annie Plume on screen, you know, that was a very fortunate occurrence. We were in Kainai, you know, the home of the Blood Tribe, south of Calgary, and our tipster knew Tyrone and said, well, maybe his mom will speak. And Annie was quite elderly, and we heard this frail voice say, come in, take off your shoes. And so Josh and I took off our shoes, and we didn't look back. When an elder invites you into their home and you have a camera, you go. And we sat on the furniture as best we could, and Josh quickly set up some lights, and we let her speak. She spoke a lot in her Blackfoot language, and Tyrone interpreted, and that made the story even more, I think, genuine, you know, and authentic. But to hear it in her own words, like, that's something Investigates does. It takes you into these kinds of homes to meet these kinds of people. You don't see that elsewhere in Canada. The mainstream's trying to catch up now, but APTN Investigates was doing it first, and telling you these Indigenous stories from an Indigenous point of view, and getting that all-important accountability that is so elusive for Indigenous communities, because most things that affect them are government policies and decisions, and they can never get a single person from government or who's implementing these policies to speak to about it. So we could do that. We could put their story, them on television to tell their story, and then we could go and get the accountability. And that is a formula that still works for the show, and I think is so rewarding for the audience to watch it.
Yeah, absolutely. What have you learned about Indigenous issues in your career as a journalist?
Just how complicated they are, and how the structures that are set up have so many barriers. You know, like my job, our job as journalists is to punch through that bureaucracy on a nearly daily basis to try to get answers. And for Indigenous peoples, that's who implements most of the rules that govern their lives. Everything from the Indian Act to, you know, recently Jordan's Principle. It's governments arguing. And it takes sometimes the humanity out of it. And so we are very devoted to centering Indigenous voices in those stories, to keeping the human element in the story. So when we do a story that Jordan's Principle isn't working, we've got a family, we've got an affected child always in our stories, to remind the reader and the viewer that these policies, these barriers affect real people, and here they are. And so I think to effectively tell these stories, we have to keep centering the people in the stories, the impacts of these decisions, and keep trying to leap over those barriers to get the answers that Indigenous peoples need.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us, Kathleen.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Brittany.